Howdy, senior seminar students. Lisa here, and this week I'm going to go through some of the methodologies that you might want to use for your paper for this term. And I've titled this Mostly Content and Discourse Analyses because I am going to talk a little bit about the historical method as well. This slide shows some possible methodologies, right? A methodology is how you go about studying something, right? And some of you may have studied statistics. Some of you may have taken Dr. Corbetta's methods class that involves a lot of quantitative or number crunching research. I put not today Satan because usually people don't go into political science because they love numbers, right? But if you know how to do it and you want to do it, then more power to you. Go for it. I don't recommend it if you don't know how to do it, right? Because I'm not going to be giving you detailed instruction in it. So I would recommend instead that if you don't have a background in stats, do qualitative research, meaning not numbers, right? So last time I taught this class last fall, I did a week on ethnographic methods, and I scrapped that week this time because in a class that lasts only 4 months, I think less than 4 months, you don't really have time to do an ethnography, right? So an ethnography is a study of a people group. Typically the anthropologist goes out and studies the Aboriginal terrorists out in somewhere, you could do more modern versions of it, right? I mean, you could try to live among the Boogaloo and see what there is to see about them and assess whether they're terrorists, etc. But terrorists usually don't give you a whole lot of access, right? Even if they do, it's going to take time to to get their trust, years probably. And basically, like I said, in a study that you can have to complete as quickly as you will for this class, you don't have the time. Historical analysis is possible, and a content or discourse analysis is also possible. And in fact, I strongly recommend the latter for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. And if you can think of another methodology that you want to use, run it past me. Okay, so historical methods. This usually entails the library. Right? And of course, given our current COVID situation, I'm not entirely sure whether you have full access to the stacks right now, but I know that the librarians are working and probably are pretty bored and would be happy to help you out. All right, so here's one example of a historical approach to terrorism. And here I'm not just talking about, well, it deals with history, I'm talking about a historical approach, right? So what this scholar has done is studied France in the late 1800s, looking at the anarcho-terrorists in France, and I've put a little arrow next to basically the main point. The debate over the anarchist terrorists of end of the century France makes for a revealing case study of the ways in which democratic societies respond to the threat of homegrown terrorism. Right, so he's looking at a very little finite piece of history, and he's saying, my in-depth study of this little piece shows something universally relevant. Whether this is scientifically valid, right, is a whole other question, right? There's a whole debate as to the role of the single case study. But in any case, that's one way to do it is, I'm looking at this broader theory or this broader problem, but I'm going to focus my efforts on this itty-bitty little situation, a case study. All right, so here's another. This one is from northern Nigeria. And these scholars do a historical analysis of Boko Haram, right? Literally translates to Western education is forbidden, right? That's a terrorist group in Nigeria. You probably heard about them some years back when they kidnapped hundreds of Nigerian schoolgirls. So Boko Haram attacks on schools in other cities in northern Nigeria, the effect on educational management. So they are looking at the challenges facing school administrators, teachers, and students in the region. And then they go into some very specific policy prescriptions for northern Nigeria. Right? So they're doing a historical analysis. In this case, it doesn't look like they're trying to create grand theory or anything, right? They're seriously concerned about education in Nigeria, right? And they're coming up with conclusions for what the government should do based on the history of this group. So if you do historical research, it is important, and I tell myself this, and I don't always listen, but it is important to establish parameters. Again, this class is 4 months. I think I actually have your paper due at the end of November. You have to make sure your project will be doable. So ways of establishing parameters or limits on your study would be, for example, looking at 4 moments in the French Revolution. Rather than saying I'm studying the entire French Revolution and terrorism, right? I'm going to study 4 particular moments. Limit my study to that. In the book that I'm writing that will not die, about a half dozen case studies of rape in civil war. Right? I'm not looking at rape in war across space and time. Maybe look at 1 or 2 states in India with a large indigenous population rather than the entire country of India. Right? Maybe you limit the time frame on your study to the last 30 years or the last 3 months, right? Rather than look at all the temple bombings in, say, for example, Sri Lanka, you would study just 2 of them. So hopefully you get my point. You've got to be able to justify why you've set these delimitations, right? So that it shouldn't just be random. But basically you want to make sure that your topic is narrow enough that it is something that you can accomplish. And this is one of the things that I see done incorrectly most often by undergraduates. Well, heck, even graduates, even postgraduates, is coming up with a topic that's too broad. Right? So in terms of your sources of data for historical research, like I said, if you're doing history, it's probably going to be texts. You can do interviews. Given, again, our COVID situation, you're going to have some troubles interviewing people, probably. I know that my adjunct over in Intro to Women's Studies, who does the Invisible Histories project of LGBTQ history in the Deep South, they've pretty much had to go on pause because most of the people they're interviewing are quite old, and so they can't risk killing them off, etc. So you'll probably be looking at texts, which would include books, newspaper articles, such as the one here, which when I should have been researching on my book at the library, instead I pulled up various terrorist episodes in Alabama or Birmingham history, right? So you could look at, for example, this particular riot, and upon digging, I found that this was actually an early African-American communist movement in the United States. This is early 30s. Yeah, early 30s. But in any case, so you might look at how different texts present the same episode, right? You might look at some multimedia, such as film, audio recordings. I know that in criminal justice, they have that, some of the people are working on that database of terrorist videos. I had an interesting paper based on those last term. The one warning I would give for you, if you choose to do that, is it can be pretty grisly, right? So if you're sensitive to violence, you might not want to do that. So then what you do is you collect your data, and this may be going to the library or picking up your books from the library these days. Stern has curbside pickup if you like. Also, there are a variety of online archives, and I will post these. I will post them in a file called paper-related stuff on Canvas, right? So that if you want to peruse these links, you can. And if you come up with any other online archives relevant to historical research on terrorism, or any research on terrorism, really scream so that I can share them with other people. I've put interviews down here. Again, that's going to be difficult unless you know for sure that you can do it, by phone or online or something like that. Archive.org is a treasure trove for books, videos, podcasts, audio recordings, etc. Free registration. They have a lot of library books that you can check out if you want to, and some of them are borrow for 24 hours, some of them are borrow online for 1 hour, but it doesn't charge you anything they don't charge you to set up an account. I have an account. I did say use with caution because it is very difficult to report anything on that site. I have tried flagging. I went down a rabbit hole last night of Nazi children's books, and boy, there's some terrifying stuff on that site. But in any case, use with caution because some of it is definitely not academic, right? And some of it is really offensive, right? So apparently, the neo-Nazis of the world have been using this as a platform to spread their ideas. Library of Congress is where I liberated a lot of the images that I've put in this PowerPoint. And I don't think that they're back to full operations. I think that they still are largely shut down because of COVID, but they do have a lot of collections online. So if you're researching a topic that has to do with the United States, and particularly United States history, it can be a gold mine. Stern Library has a lot of databases, digital databases, and I've listed here some of the ones that might be useful for the study of terrorism. And again, I will post this particular list in that a folder under files called paper-related stuff, so that you can come back to it. Now, once you've gathered all your data, then you analyze it, right? And you apply it to your research question or hypothesis, and hypothesis, right? And the next few weeks, you're going to be hashing that out with your small groups. Good research also disproves alternative hypotheses, right? So a hypothesis is, basically your theory as to why something is, right? And not only do you want to say X causes Y, but it's great if you can also say, we know that Z does not cause Y because, right? Okay, now moving on to what I assigned to the readings about this week, content and discourse analysis. And there are differences between these. I'm kind of lumping them together in this lecture. So here's one example of a content analysis. And here we see that the authors have compared ISIS-related coverage among American, British, and Middle Eastern media organizations, identifying the media frames basically being perspectives, or the spin that each of these media organizations put on ISIS. And the findings reveal differences in the amount of coverage and in the ways that each organization chose to frame its coverage, right? So they're not looking at a truth about terrorism. They're not trying to understand facts about ISIS or anything like that. They're basically looking at media representation, right? And I don't know if they go into what factors account for the differences. Second example, again about Boko Haram in Western Central Africa. Here we are looking at Boko Haram's transnational intentions, right? So are they simply trying to recruit people in their area, or are they trying to get jihadists from around the world to come into Chad, for example, and the country of Chad, and join Boko Haram, right? So they find that Boko Haram expresses itself in an intrinsically domestic orientation, and as such, transnationalization is unlikely, right? So I know that Boko Haram's videos are in Hausa, for example. Hausa is a language that you're not going to find a whole lot of people in Asia or the United States who understand it, right, unless they're from Nigeria originally. So, basically if they were trying to recruit people from disgruntled youth from Alabama, right? They would use English. And so I assigned some reading from Richard Jackson on discourse analysis. That was out of Critical Methods in Terrorism Studies. And Richard Jackson is a friend of mine and also the daddy or granddaddy, I guess I should say, of critical terrorism studies. Now, I remember the first time I met him, it wasn't the first time I dealt with him, but the first time I actually met him in person at a conference, after sitting there listening to him, I said, why can you not just speak in plain English, right? And people looked at me as if I had thrown a bomb in the room, right? And he said something about, well, you know, you have to be taken seriously as an academic or whatever. But he has a good sense of humor. Unfortunately, his writing requires a dictionary, right? So I wanted to go through this with you closely. He writes that an understanding of language as constitutive, meaning making something, or productive of meaning rather than simply descriptive of an external reality. Obviously, I missed the first part of that sentence. Understanding of discourses involving structures of signification. I tell you what, why don't I just go through what the hard words mean, and then you read it for yourself. So discourse means the talk about something or the discussion about something. So we talk about, you know, the discourse on nationalism, the discourse on democracy, etc. Signification is the process of making meaning. Contingent means dependent upon. Intertextual is among different texts. And counter-hegemonic means against the status quo. So it was at this point that I realized I needed to contact another friend of mine, Mike Ledgerwood, over at Samford, who teaches French, but he's got a background in linguistics, because I said, my students are going to have a hard time with this. So he helped me out, and I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so Jackson says, in other words, while political violence is experienced as a brute fact by its direct victims, its wider cultural political meaning and its analytical, descriptive, or legal status is as an act of war, crime, insurgency, or terrorism, for example, is decided by socially negotiated agreement. And intersubjective, meaning shared between or among two or more conscious minds. Intersubjective practices involving political authorities, investigators, judges, the media, academic experts, etc. Right? So all of these authorities, the media, professors, judges, investigators, politicians, right, they decide what terrorism is, right? And so each one of the images I put here is a counter-hegemonic movement trying to redefine what terrorism is, right, or resisting what redefinitions of terrorism. I thought this spreading coronavirus is not terrorism was interesting. So Jackson writes that terrorism is an empty signifier. Right, so we've already talked about the idea that terrorism itself is meaningless, right? So an empty signifier means that it's a reference to something that's meaningless, right? A meaningless reference to something that's meaningless. It's a classic example of a contested concept because there is no terrorism that you can point to, right? It's not like a star-bellied sneetch. Well, okay, I guess that doesn't exist either, right? It's not like a red-headed woodpecker where you can point to it and everybody would agree that's a red-headed woodpecker, right? It's a contested concept because terrorism is in the eye of the beholder, as these two images from this summer's protests indicate. So one example that you can look at is the discourse, or talking about the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. I picked two different articles from September 2019, and the left is from the Financial Times. Looks like this gentleman has a flaming bottle in his hand, right? Pro-democracy protesters is what they call the same people that over here, on the other hand, I have Chinese state media. They are calling them rioters. The photo shows a rioter, and also Black Terror. When I first saw the headline, I thought, what sort of racist? And then I clicked on it, and I think it's because of the black bloc tactic used by the protesters. Black bloc is not a group, it's a strategy. Black bloc is you wear all black, conceal as much of your face as possible, not only so that you can't be identified by security cameras, etc., but also so that you blend in with the crowd, right? So that it's not as easy for somebody to track you down, identify you as part of a crowd. Okay, so we have pro-democracy protesters versus terrorists, rioters, and radical students and teachers. So here we have, note the riot police used tear gas and water cannons, right? So the violence is being perpetrated by the police, according to the Financial Times. Here, of course, we have a rioter about to hurl a petrol bomb toward the police. So here it's reversed. The police are the victims, and this black terror rioter is the perpetrator of this violence, right? So you could probably analyze the pictures 6 bazillion ways, right? I'm sure there's a million symbols in here to unpack, but that'll give you a start. Right, so that's the sort of analysis that you could do in your paper, which might be kind of interesting, right? And fortunately, my buddy over at Sanford, Dr. Ledgerwood, gave me a very clever short film on the basics of semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs, and a sign is something that represents something else, the object. So for example, here we have a car bomb, and here we have various terrorist icons. I think I got this from, like icons you can download to your computer or whatever. I don't know why you would want a terrorist button on your webpage, but whatever. So here we have the car bomb, right? And it looks kind of like the car bomb, right? So that would be an icon according to the film. But I'm going to stop it at this point, and here is where you should pause the video and move on over to the link that I provided below to this cool little video about semiotics. And that ends part 1 of Module 2.